Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective, your Christian nerd bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun. In this video, we're going to be comparing the New King James Version with the English Standard Version. So the reason I'm comparing these two translations is I just did a video comparing the New King James with the New American Standard Bible, and people seem to really like that, but some people felt that it would be great to see a comparison of the New King James Version with the English Standard Version, both also very popular translations and very interesting to compare. Now I have to say that in comparing these two in this video, this is not going to be extremely thorough. I just want to give some examples here to show you kind of a taste of the differences between the two. But actually what you're going to see is that they're actually really similar to each other. They have very similar wording. And a major reason for that is that both the New King James Version and the English Standard Version are in the line of the King James Version. Now that's not surprising when it comes to the New King James. It bears the name of the King James. It's just called the New King James. But the English Standard Version is still in the line of the King James Version if you look at where it comes from. So really the English Standard Version is an update of the Revised Standard Version, which updated the American Standard Version, which essentially came from the King James Version. So both the New King James Version and the English Standard Version have a lot of wording that is reflective of the King James Version. Now I will say that the New King James Version is actually more like the King James Version in its wording than the English Standard Version is, and we'll see that when we look at these examples. So what I would say generally is that the English Standard Version is more traditional in its wording than a lot of other translations, but it's actually more accessible to a lot of present-day readers than the King James Version and even the New King James Version. And one of the reasons for that is the formatting, because the New King James Version retains those italicized words, which I know a lot of you Bible students like italicized words for supplied words in English. But for a lot of readers, when they're reading a Bible and they see italicized words and capitalized pronouns, I think it just seems out of place to them or something they're not used to. Maybe it seems kind of noisy, busy when they look at it. Whereas when you read the English Standard Version, the way that it's formatted, I think is just really accessible to people today. It's more like what they're used to reading when they read other literature. There's not italicized words in there. The first example I'm going to show you is Isaiah 26:3, which, as you'll see here, these are really similarly worded. But the italics you have here in the New King James Version on the left, no italics for the English Standard Version on the right. But when you actually see how these read, you will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. The English Standard Version says you keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. So these two translations are really similar in this passage. The New American Standard Bible actually changes it more, which I showed. So I think the English Standard Version is even more like the New King James Version than the New American Standard Bible. And so that's something you're going to see when you look at these two. When you look at Psalm 23, a very classic passage, well known, you can see here in the New King James, it reads a lot like the King James Version, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But when you look at the English Standard Version, it says the same thing here, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And so, I mean, when I'm looking at these two, I'm really not seeing very much difference. One difference you will see in verse 4 is in the New King James Version, it says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." And in the English Standard Version, it says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." That's just an example there of what I was talking about, that the English Standard Version is a little bit more modern. The New King James Version says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," reflective of the King James Version. And it sounds nice. It sounds kind of quaint, and some people will really like that. But the English Standard Version saying, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," that's worded more the way we would word things today. In 1 Corinthians 1:10, the New King James says, "Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." The English Standard Version says, "I appeal to you, brothers," with a footnote saying, "or brothers and sisters." Now that's interesting. The New King James Version retains that more archaic word, brethren, which in a way is nice because, at least to my ear, I think that could signify men and women, even though maybe technically it's a masculine word. But when you read the word brothers in the English Standard Version, then you get into that issue of, well, is he only talking to men there? Because brothers is definitely a masculine word. So they have a footnote there saying it can mean brothers and sisters. So that's a difference, but that's again that difference between the New King James Version being willing to use a King James word and the English Standard Version going with a more modern word. Instead of brethren, it says brothers, which is a word we would use today. In 1 Corinthians 1:31, another example of the language difference, the New King James Version, as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. The English Standard Version, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. So out of those two, how would you normally word things when you're talking in English? Would you say, let us glory in something, or would you talk about boasting in something? And I think for most of us English speakers today, we would use the word boast in that phrasing and in that kind of context. We do talk about getting glory today, but I don't usually hear people talk about glorying in something. So the New King James says something there that, again, if you're used to the King James Version, it sounds nice. But I would say the English Standard Version modernizes that a little bit more, makes it more accessible to readers today because it reads like our English more. But it still retains a lot of that literary beauty that you get in the King James and in the New King James. When you look at Luke chapter 2 about the Nativity of Jesus, this is a classic passage in terms of its wording. And again, I'm just seeing here in both of these translations really similar wording. Not a whole lot different. Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. In the English Standard Version, in the same region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night, and an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. Really, the only difference I'm seeing there is the word behold. But that's actually a textual difference because it says here in the footnote on the New King James that the NU omits behold. There's also a textual difference in verse 14. You can see here, on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And this says peace among those with whom he is pleased. And that's actually a textual difference here according to the English Standard Version. So that gets to how the New King James Version is based on the Textus Receptus more, whereas the English Standard Version in the New Testament is based on the critical text more, and I've talked about that in other videos. So that's really just a matter of people's own personal views and preference, which they prefer. I think it's good to have translations that are reflective of both texts, so I like to use both. But you can see here that they do have a different textual basis, and that's another difference. Now, that doesn't mean that these are major differences. You can see here it's an issue of whether one translation has that added word behold, or maybe how something is phrased. But there are some textual differences between these two translations. And we'll look at one more passage here. This is Romans chapter 5, the first 5 verses. New King James says, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And it goes on. In the English Standard Version, it says, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. These are really similar wordings here, but I do notice that the New King James keeps one long sentence here in these two verses. The English Standard Version breaks that down into two sentences. So it's not really a matter of translation philosophy difference. They're both very literal translations. But I would say the English Standard Version, breaking that into two sentences, just makes it a little bit easier for English readers today to read and understand rather than having really long sentences. So that, I think, might be another difference that you would see in the English Standard Version, is maybe in certain cases they're breaking the sentences down a little bit more than the King James and the New King James. So my conclusion in all of this is that the English Standard Version is a wonderful companion to the New King James Version, and vice versa. So if you use the English Standard Version a lot, it's great to have the New King James to have as a comparison for textual reasons, among other reasons too, just to see different wordings. And if you use the New King James Version, it's neat to have the English Standard Version as a companion. And I would also mention that really, as you can see, they both have a great literary quality to them because they're both in the line of the King James Version. So the English Standard Version, in my opinion, is really wonderful because you get a lot of that literary beauty, classic language that we're used to in the line of the King James, but it is more modern and accessible to readers today because of its formatting, because of its wording. And so I really think the English Standard Version has a lot going for it. Which one are you going to primarily use if you want to go with a translation like this? Probably has to do with your context. If you're in a context that's going to use the Textus Receptus more, then the New King James Version is probably going to be more fitting for you to use primarily. If you're in a context that uses the critical text more, then the English Standard Version is going to be a great primary translation. But both of them are more literal translations. Both of them are in the line of the King James and retain a lot of that beauty. So they're both really wonderful translations. So I hope you've enjoyed this comparison and have learned something from it. I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.